Welcome back. This is Geography 130, Lecture 18. As you know, I did not post any new slides for today, so we're still working on the slides from Lecture 17. One housekeeping note, I did post the distribution, or rather I sent it around as an email to all of you, the distribution of the grades on the midterm. Are there any questions about that? Okay. So the lecture here is principally following up on Kloppenberg, which was the reading for this past Thursday. I'm going to continue to spell out some of the arguments that Kloppenberg makes elsewhere in the book, beyond the chapter that I asked you to read. But the other reading for today comes from Connolly. We're picking up Fatal Misconception again, and I asked you to, for today and also for Thursday, to read a couple more chapters from that book. And I want to just briefly sketch out the relationship between these two readings. As you will know, if you've read the chapter, at least the first one from Connolly for this week, one of the major players in the story is the Rockefeller Foundation. John D. Rockefeller III and the foundation that his family had set up played an extremely important role in the sort of politics and funding of efforts to control world population, beginning, well, for purposes of the foundation's role, beginning around World War II and continuing strongly through the 1950s. And Connolly doesn't say very much about it, but the Rockefeller Foundation was simultaneously very much involved in agriculture, and in particular in what's come to be known as the Green Revolution, which we'll talk about here a little bit later. And so it's interesting to sort of put these two together. It echoes a lot of what we've seen in the earlier history, the sort of two sides of the Malthusian approach to population, right? On the one side, questions of the growth of human numbers, and on the other side, the question of whether there's enough food for all these people, and whether agricultural productivity can increase rapidly enough to keep up with human population. If you remember when I talked a little bit about William Vogt and his book, oh my God, Road to Survival, almost blanked on that. Vogt had spent time in Latin America during World War II and had been struck by the poverty there and became a forceful spokesperson, leader for population control as an environmental movement, or in the name of the environment. And he, as I said, constructed his argument in that book around the concept of carrying capacity. And it was interesting that he resolved the contradiction of carrying capacity by, on the one side, insisting that it was an absolute limit, that human numbers were simply too great. And you can pick up here and there in the Connolly reading that he was, at the very least, a crypto-eugenicist. He very much felt that the poor people of the world in their reproductive habits were some kind of threat to civilization, and he articulated that increasingly in terms of environmental degradation and issues of the environment. On the other side, however, he essentially suggested that the way we should address the problem, in his book anyway, was to increase carrying capacity, was to do things to conserve the environment, to prevent soil erosion, to modernize agriculture, to bring the benefits of modern technology and agricultural practices to the third world. And in this way, sort of we could have our cake and eat it too. You know, if we took care of the environment and we also increased agricultural production, we might be able to sort of make our way through this contradiction. And so you get a kind of technocratic solution, right? And of course, this has got serious political implications as well, and you see those very forcefully in the Connolly reading. But the package of controlling population growth on the one side and increasing agricultural output on the other side came to be, in many ways, what the Rockefeller Foundation was espousing and promoting, and doing it very much on a global scale, envisioning this as something that not only could happen, but had to happen pretty much everywhere in the world. And this is, as you'll notice from Connolly, very much caught up in Cold War politics, right? The fear is not only that there are lots of people out there with not enough to eat, but that these people might, in fact, turn to communism, turn to socialism, turn to the other side of the Cold War in response to the conditions that they were living in. And that, therefore, this was a civilizing, democratic, and thoroughly patriotic kind of project to launch. So the two pieces here are tied together, even though they appear, they're treated rather separately in these two books. So with that said, let's get back to Kloppenberg. When we left off last time, we were talking about the movement of germplasm, how the seeds of different plants, agricultural plants in particular, moved around in the 19th and 20th centuries. And that this was very much a state project. This was a project of the colonial imperial powers. They recognized it as an important part of their competition with one another. They set about quite systematically and in many ways with a kind of military imperative almost, a secrecy, a clandestine activity if need be, to collect and hoard, acquire and protect germplasm as a way of increasing the agricultural output of their colonies, and sort of it was part of the imperial chess game. In the 19th century, the United States got involved with this, as we mentioned last time, initially in a kind of ad hoc fashion through the diplomatic network, and then in a more systematic fashion, headed up by the Patent Office. Once the USDA got involved in this, it became a major part of Department of Agriculture research. They sponsored more than 50 expeditions to different parts of the world, specifically to hunt for plants, hunt for seed, and bring those seeds back to the United States where they could be banked in various kinds of research institutions and experimented with, tested, and subsequently distributed to farmers. Now, the framework that Kloppenberg uses to think about this concerns property, the property status of plant genetic resources. And he identifies a contradiction in the different ways that seeds have been brought into property regimes. On the one hand, they can be treated as the common heritage of mankind or humanity's collective genetic estate. The idea here being these are just the genetic materials of plants around the world. They have grown on their own. They've grown with human assistance and interference and movement, but they are essentially not any single party's property. Nobody can claim to own them. They are available as a free good apart from the costs of collection. If you can figure out how to get your hands on them, you don't really owe anybody a payment for the genetic aspects of the seed, right? So if you send an expedition to Latin America to look for seed, sure, you might buy seed from various kinds of merchants or farmers themselves. You might go someplace and say, could we have some of your seed? You might steal it if you felt like you needed to, but in buying seed, if you bought it, you weren't actually paying for anything other than that particular batch of seeds. You weren't expected to pay for the fact that those seeds could then be grown and produce more seed, and at that point, you would have complete control over what you did with them. You could grow them and grow them again and grow them again and grow them again and end up with colossal amounts of seed from that original packet or little bag of seeds. And you may have paid for that bag of seeds, but there was no expectation that the merchant didn't expect you to pay for all the other seeds that you might subsequently produce from those, right? And in that sense, it's a kind of public good. The self-reproducing capacity of the seeds and the ability to perpetuate that genetic information is essentially free. On the other hand, of course, the other way of thinking about the property, seeds as property, is to think of it as private property, protected by patent law and enforced by states. And this is where the protection of certain plant varieties as the proprietary, as owned by a company or a firm, becomes important. And obviously, a firm is not going to want to invest in something like this if they can't know ahead of time that those investments and claims to those seeds or that variety as its property is going to be backed up and enforced by states. And so Kloppenberg's discussion of how this plays out over the course of the 20th century is framed by this contradiction. Are there any questions? So in effect, it turns out that both of these statuses of property played important roles in this history. On the one hand, at the point of collection, the genetic resources in seeds were uncompensated and essentially a collective good. However, once they were sold to farmers, domestically and overseas, they could be and were treated as private property that could be defended in court. And how these two contradictory property statuses interact and change is a large part of what Kloppenberg is trying to describe in his book. He says, it is highly ironic that the third world resource that the developed nations have arguably extracted for the longest time, derived the greatest benefits from, and still depend upon the most, is one for which no compensation is paid. Indeed, it is not merely ironic, it is contradictory. The Green Revolution is the playing out of this contradiction in Kloppenberg's analysis. It begins with the Rockefeller Foundation and the USDA during World War II, meeting to talk about the kinds of concerns that Vogt had, and would later express, to talk about how to increase agricultural productivity overseas, particularly in poor parts of the world. And the challenge was not only to feed the world, but to make money doing it, to make feeding the world something that would be profitable, a kind of private sector growth machine. And they launched a project to gather still more germplasm from the countries where there was a lot of it, a lot of diversity of germplasm, and to bank it in the US and abroad, to study it, hybridize it, develop seeds, and ship them overseas. And there came to be a very elaborate institutional system in place for collecting seeds all over the world, housing them, banking them, maintaining them, in conjunction with foreign governments, foreign universities, researchers, and to use this as a sort of infrastructure within which to turn peasant farmers into American-style farmers around the world. And green here is not intended to refer to sort of green in the environmentalist sense that we use it today, but green in the sense of food production, of emphasizing a sort of revolution in agriculture at a global scale. As Kloppenberg describes, this was an enormous benefit to first world industry. A very large percentage of agricultural production feeds into industrial uses, right? Whether it's oils, whether it's the corn that turns into God knows how many other things. The production of agricultural inputs, commodities, on a larger scale means lower prices. And lower prices for these inputs means better margins for those industries that buy these crops and turn them into all the different things that they turn them into. And one of the aspects of U.S. agricultural research, as mentioned last time, has precisely been to develop new industrial applications for crops. The biggest genetic contributors are West Central Asia and Latin America. In other words, these are the parts of the world that have contributed the greatest amount of genetic material in the form of germplasm to this green revolution. One of these, obviously, is in the Old World. One is in the New World. If you're thinking about the movement between Old and New Worlds, in this case, one from each place, one region from each place, is critical to this story. Nonetheless, third world regions are sources of 95.7% of the world food crop. And it's important that you look at the way in which Kloppenberg is dividing up the world in his calculation of this, right? So, for instance, the fact that wheat originates in the Middle East or Central Asia is incredibly important because wheat is one of the major crops, food crops in the world. If you define the Middle East as part of the third world, as he does, then this statistic is true, is accurate. If you chose, for whatever reason, to consider the Middle East not part of the third world, that would change this calculation, right? All of the developed world, Kloppenberg shows, excluding Japan, depends on non-indigenous crops for more than 90% of their food. And by that he means the food crops that they consume have their genetic origins elsewhere than in these developed countries. So he's got a couple of big tables in his book. This one treating food crops, the next one treats industrial crops. And he's got the regions of the world here on the two axes of this table. Regions of production, Chino-Japanese, Indo-Chinese, Australian, etc. Down this side, regions of diversity broken out in the same way. So the point here is that 37.2% of the production from the Chino-Japanese region is of crops derived genetically from that region. So by the time you get to the end, total dependence is the amount of those food crops coming genetically from other parts of the world. So this number and this number will always add up to 100, right? And the point is, if you read down this column here, virtually all the regions of the world are dependent in some significant measure on crops derived from other parts of the world. So West Central Asia depends for only 31% of its food on non-indigenous crops. Indo-Chinese, only 33%, but the others are all 50% or higher. North America is 100%. Euro-Siberian, 91%. Mediterranean, 98%, that kind of thing. Australia, also 100%. Just to say the crops that they consume for food, whether they produce them there or not, are not indigenous to those regions. Any questions about that? Does that make sense? Here's the same table for industrial crops. Again, you see very heavy dependence on non-indigenous crops. I guess in one sense all this is saying to us is that agricultural production is globalized in the sense of the movement of the germplasm itself from different parts of the world to other parts of the world. And this is his way of supporting his contention that third world areas have a kind of genetic claim or a kind of geographical historical claim to having been the original point of origin of these crops. Yeah? If you trace it back far enough, yes. And that's a key consideration. I mean, this is not saying that all of the wheat farmers in the upper Midwest buy their wheat seed every year from Central Asia. No. They buy their wheat seed very likely from a U.S. company. If you follow the genetic material that's in that wheat seed far enough back, eventually you will get to West Central Asia. In that sense, there's sort of no such thing as local food, right? Our food is, at least evolutionarily, no longer local. Yeah? Well, it needed them, but it only needed them for that initial transfer, right? You only need to be able to get that seed once. And once you've gotten it, if you take care of it and plant it and replant it and continue to harvest seed from it, essentially you no longer depend on the third world. I mean, Kloppenberg's claim here is something of a kind of geohistorical property claim that he is at least raising to our attention, if not flat out asserting. I mean, in a sense, if the genetic material in the seeds that farmers plant had been treated as private property from the outset, then in some sense perhaps we would owe some kind of royalty payment to the people wherever they originally came from, right? Wherever those plants originally were found and gathered and collected. Obviously, it would be very, very difficult to establish who such a group of people might actually be. I mean, chances are that the people who originally produced the seed that eventually, through the generations ended up on our farms are all since long dead. And even they probably would not have thought to themselves, oh, you owe me money for this, right? Nowadays, it's a much more complicated situation. And it's important to stress that this kind of thing does still go on now. I mean, the building of germplasm bank facilities to store the seeds from around the world continues to this very day. I believe that one of them, fairly recently, a sort of mega one, intended to survive like any kind of cataclysm you can imagine, has been recently constructed somewhere in the far north of Europe. I can't remember if it's Iceland or Norway. It's where? Islands in the Arctic Ocean north of Norway. I mean, they're actively banking seeds, understanding that, in many ways, this is the ultimate resource we all depend on for food, right? To be able to have a storehouse of these seeds is viewed as an extremely important long-term sort of insurance policy against the possible loss of the genetic material contained in seeds. And it's important to remember, again, that every time a plant is put in the ground and grown and seeds are collected, the seeds you collect will be similar to the ones you planted, but they won't be identical, right? They will, in the process of that one generation of reproduction, mutate, very possibly adapting to the circumstances of that site, that year. And so there's potentially a kind of infinite range of germplasm that we might potentially wish to somehow preserve or save, right? Because just because it's wheat doesn't mean that it's not actually different wheat at a genetic level every place it's grown, every time it's grown. Now we'll get into that in a moment, but it's an important consideration. I started to say, in today's context, where in addition to all this agriculturally related germplasm collecting and banking, there is active pursuit of genetic material for other purposes, such as the development of pharmaceuticals, right? And in today's world, in part because of this kind of scholarship and activism related to it, there is very, very heightened concern about who owns this stuff, right? If you find a plant in a rainforest in Indonesia, and you think it might provide genetic material for a new drug that will, fight cancer or some other important disease, and you potentially might make millions and millions and millions of dollars from it, it's no longer accepted that you can just take one of these plants out of the ground and take it home and not even worry about who you might be taking it from. In some cases, it's indigenous peoples who may have helped you find it or told you that they've used it for some medicinal purpose. It may be a nation state that says, wait a minute, this genetic heritage is ours. And if you want to take it and use it, you need to be prepared to pay us something for it. And this is a very, very big and complicated realm of both research and activism right now, with potentially hundreds of millions of dollars at stake. Yeah. Right. The question of how you turn something that is, in a sense, the common heritage of mankind or of some group of people someplace, right, a plant that you happen to find and collect, how to turn that into something that you can assert a property claim to is a very complicated and interesting question. Yes, under current law, you can't patent something until you have taken it